Okay, I think we're live, and this is the first homelessness streaming session. Although I've called it Housing Law Questions up there, but we're actually focusing on homelessness today. And it's me, William Flack, and Mike Hayden.
Hey, you right there, guys?
And this is going to be pretty scrappy because it's the first time we've done a streaming session. So it's going to be scrappy in terms of format because I'm still fiddling about with how to make this look okay. And then we've had a quick chat about what we're going to talk about, but it's still not as structured as hopefully it will be later on, or as smooth. Shall I just say a bit about how we came to be doing this together, Mike? And
Yeah, I think that'd be helpful. Yeah, it'd be a good one to start off with.
I think I met you, Mike, must be about 3 years ago now, because we were both at a seminar and I recognised you from your YouTube videos on homelessness and came up and told you I was a fan. And we have been in touch since then, haven't we? And we've done a couple of chats. I don't know if we've put them on. Have we put anything on YouTube? I don't think.
No, we haven't.
Not
My,
together,
my,
but
my I still tell my daughter that's the only time I've been recognised. I was well happy.
yeah. I'm surprised it hasn't happened more because there's a lot. I'm sure a lot of people watch it. What the plan is with this is that we do streaming rather than just putting out videos that are just one-offs. The idea is we'd have these regular sessions where we just chat about things, and hopefully in time we can promote the session taking place, and then people can watch it in real time while it's happening and join in, because we can either have comments that we can put up on the screen and answer, or we can have up to, I think it's up to 3 people on here. So if somebody was wanting to jump in and have a chat with us, they could do that. I should also just say I'm a solicitor. I specialise in housing law and particularly homelessness. I'm very interested in. And Mike, how would you describe yourself?
So not a solicitor, but we try and use the law. So I think it's interesting and can be surprising how much you can do without being a solicitor, particularly if you pursue the complaint process and lobby a little bit, if that's the right word for it. So make relationships with local MPs and councillors and stuff and use that as kind of ways to get change. Yeah, so I do casework, but I'm in the voluntary sector and deliver training around that kind of stuff as well.
And you've been getting some pretty good stuff in terms of the training out. I was really impressed with that webinar you did. It must be getting on for a couple of years ago now. The first one with Jan Luber and Sarah Steinhardt, both on the same bill, which was quite an achievement because that's 2 of the very top people in homelessness law. And you've got more stuff coming up, haven't you? You've got a training session coming up on the Equality Act.
Yeah, I guess that again, that's Sarah Steinhardt doing that. So yeah, we're organising it, and it's geared towards non-solicitors and working out how we support people with disabilities, particularly disabilities, other equality issues as well as get. But it's really even simple stuff like, to go off on a bit of a tangent already. So last night in Bedford, which is where I work, we asked some questions at the local housing committee, the council's housing committee. And one of the questions was simply, does the council go far enough to identify people with disabilities and identify what reasonable adjustments need to be made? And immediately the answer was, yeah, the council needs to put that into the process. So even things like that actually will affect a lot of people potentially, particularly if they actually use that opportunity to tell the council at the start of the process, struggle reading, or I'm going to struggle to access certain types of temporary accommodation or whatever. It's going to mean that actually potentially a lot of people will benefit from just something as simple as asking a question like that. Yeah, so that's the kind of the aim. I think certainly I've been working for a long time in the sector and not really had any understanding of equality law. So hopefully Sarah's going to do a lot of good stuff around explaining that. And so there are still some places left if you happen to watch this in the next couple of days. So just get in contact on our Eventbrite or something. We'll put a link in the YouTube or something for that.
I'll put a link in the comments bit, or if you one of us can anyway. The other thing I forgot to mention, of course, is that did you set it up, or you're certainly instrumental in it, the excellent Facebook group?
Yeah, I set it up years ago now, so it took ages to get off the ground. So my supervisor, she was in a group called the Mask Stamp, which is like approved mental health practitioners, and they were asking these very like technical legal questions. So I saw that as a format and we've built this up. So as I say, it took ages to get people to be brave enough to ask questions. A lot of people think they're asking stupid questions, and they're really not stupid questions. There's so many myths out there that people are told by councils and told by professionals that there is no question too stupid because someone somewhere has been told that. Yeah.
And one of the things we've found is that the Facebook group is a really good place for people to post these questions. It can take you can put a comment on and reply to it, but I thought it'd be a really good opportunity to use these questions as springboards for things to talk about on a streaming session and go into maybe a bit more detail. And so what I thought we'd do tonight, we've got 2 examples of questions, and in future I think we might streamline this a bit and have more. But if I go to the next slide on here, which is this one. Hopefully it should work. Yeah, we'll get these terms, the questions. I think the first one here I'll go back to is bed and breakfast accommodation. And shall I read it out? And you can read the next one out, Mike, if you like. Well, I don't want to hog things. But this one, the question here, this is a real question that's been posted by somebody, but we've kept it anonymous. The council have admitted bed and breakfast and guest houses are not suitable accommodation, but they have no choice but to put people in them due to the lack of properties, their words. But how about putting a vulnerable person who has been stable with addiction issues into a guest house full of people using drugs and alcohol? The said person is starting to go backwards. Said person also has a solicitor now. How do I instruct the solicitor? Will they work off their own back? How can we challenge the council? I've already put a complaint in for them not responding to me, and I got a response for a while, but nothing since. So there's quite a lot of questions in there, really, aren't there, actually? Shall I say, I just feel like I'm hogging the thing. Do you want to have a shot at your comments on that, Mike? Or
Yeah, I can give some initial ones. Yeah, the first thing I'd say is that suitability of temporary accommodation is one of the most difficult arguments to make, particularly if you are a layperson and you don't have access to judicial review and that kind of stuff. So this is something that we've certainly come across in our work, and I'll probably go quite a long tangent if that's all right, Will, because I just want to say a few
yeah,
things on this and kind of get to make sense of it. The first thing I say is, and I always say this, is I don't hate housing officers. I'm realistic about the fact that a lot of housing officers never get training on this kind of stuff, and consequently, lots of professionals, not just housing officers, but lots of professionals will view drug and alcohol issues as a moral issue and about a lifestyle choice and those kind of things. Now, those things that those attitudes don't really stack up in our understanding of mental health issues and trauma and those kind of things. But they certainly have housing officers with a lot of power who are basically choosing whether to house someone or not. And I've certainly seen, and I've worked within teams within councils who are overtly discriminatory against people with drug and alcohol issues that we use as a reason not to help people. So I guess I want to kind of start with that kind of thing. And I think there are some things which, as I say, it's a very difficult legal issue to tackle and to go with it, particularly if you're a layperson, but there are some things you can do. So in Bedford, where I've kind of worked for a long time now, I remember you just have these opportunities sometimes to challenge attitudes within staff. So I remember seeing a Section 184 notification for someone who just had an unplanned detox, alcohol dependent, they'd had a heart attack as well. And essentially the housing officer said, and I made the argument from Crossley, I said, look, this guy's just come out of a detox. There's a high risk of relapse. The Drug and Alcohol Service was saying that as well. So I was making an argument along the Crossley kind of lines, Crossley v Westminster. And the response in the Section 184 was literally drug and alcohol, substance use is always a lifestyle choice. There's always going to be a risk there, and that's the end of it. So rather than, I did ask for a review of the decision, and it was overturned and I got him housed. But as well as doing that, I made a complaint to the chief officer of that department, who's a decent guy, and essentially laid this out. So really went back into the ICD-10 and got all these different kind of resources from NICE guidelines and a psychiatric kind of Royal Institute of Psychiatry. I can't remember what the fancy name for it is, but just made this argument to say, actually, there is no one who can say that substance use is always a lifestyle choice. Obviously, sometimes it may be, but most of the time it is not. And so that was I think at that point, they've never made the argument since along those kind of lines. And they're certainly more recently, they're very much more understanding about drug and alcohol issues. So that's a bit of a preamble. If I was facing this situation, I would say there is no easy option for a non-lawyer to do anything. But what you can do is you can start that process of challenging illegitimate attitudes within staff and policy as well. So as often happens, you have a block of flats in the town which is used for temporary accommodation, and it's used for the people who are often have the most issues, and you have all sorts of cookering and stuff going along with it. You can challenge that stuff, you can raise that politically, you can complain about stuff, particularly where you're having councils putting people into temporary accommodation that they already know is being cuckooed. There's a huge amount of stuff you can do with that. But again, looking at it from a bigger picture of safeguarding issues and Equality Act issues. So that's what I wanted to. That would be my answer to this question. As I say, I don't think there is a magic one that you're going to make the council not do this, but you can do it over a period of time. So that's my bit. Well, sorry, I've just talked for ages then.
no, it's okay. That was very helpful. Thanks. What I was going to say is that suitability is a complex issue, but I'm finding now that having been doing homelessness since the mid-90s, in the old days, most of the arguments in homelessness were about whether somebody was entitled to be housed. And so it was about intentional homelessness, priority need. And then in 2010, they changed the law, which until then had meant that if they accepted a duty, they had to give you social housing. So homelessness was a route to pretty attractive housing. So the argument tended to be about restricting access to it. But after they allowed local authorities to give people private accommodation, it wasn't. It was easier for them to say, "All right, then have something, and we'll just refer you to a private landlord." So the arguments have been much more about suitability, especially when, like Waltham Forest, for instance, have a policy of trying to send people off to Stoke-on-Trent, which isn't much fun if you've never been there and you'd be uprooted. And the other thing I'd say, going back historically, is that the courts were traditionally very unsympathetic to homeless people and suitability. In fact, there was a case called Pulhofer back in the mid-80s, which was so reactionary that Parliament had to intervene, because until that case, the law only said you have to provide accommodation. It didn't say it had to be suitable, which is almost like a comedy sketch, because then the judge said they were given some awful place, literally really bad condition, but the judge said it's accommodation, it isn't very nice accommodation. And that was so shocking that even the Margaret Thatcher's government changed the law on that one to say it's got to be suitable. But you can see the background and the sort of attitude you're up against. But things have got a lot better lately with the Homelessness Reduction Act, because one of the things that's even now still filtering through, even though that came in 2017, is that councils have to carry out full assessments of people's housing needs. And they also have to carry out an assessment now of the suitability of accommodation. So often if they, for instance, in this case, to go back to the question, in the old days, it would have been very difficult to challenge this kind of decision, because the council would have said, "Oh, we're very sorry to hear that he doesn't like the accommodation, and we're very impressed that he's dealt with his addiction problems, but ultimately that's his problem. We're not going to do anything." Whereas now you could say, what did you do before putting him in there? What assessment did you carry out? And the odds are they didn't do anything. And if they had done, they'd have had to conclude that this sort of thing isn't suitable. And also, the Equality Act and the recognition over the last 10, 20 years of the nature of disability has helped, because in the old days, there was a tendency to say that drug use was just something that anybody does as a lifestyle choice, but usually it's a form of self-medication, and that there may well be underlying problems. Most people don't become crack addicts just for the hell of it. Popular mythology says you smoke a joint and the next day you're on heroin, but there's usually underlying reasons which would amount to a disability. So you could say the person's been discriminated against if they're put in accommodation which would be unsuitable. So I think there's grounds for challenging. The question then is, how do you do it? And as you say, it's difficult if you're not a lawyer, and it's even difficult if you are a lawyer, because there's lots of tricky things, like if the accommodation is provided to you while they're making inquiries, so it's interim accommodation under section 188 of the Housing Act 96, the way you challenge that is through judicial review proceedings in the High Court. So you have to write a pre-action letter saying why it's unsuitable. But if as soon as they issue a decision saying, OK, we accept a duty, the goalposts change and you have to go to the county court under section 204, having asked for a review under section 202. And I had this once with Hackney. We issued a judicial review and they said, OK, we accept a duty, so that's the end of your judicial review. And the judge kicked us out of the High Court, and then we had to go through them, get the appeal together, and then we won the appeal, but it was a nuisance. So it's very fiddly, and you can find yourself thinking, what sort of challenge do I have to make? But the bottom line is, if they've not made a decision yet, it's judicial review, and if they have made a decision, it's a homelessness review. And you may say it's a bit of a problem, because a review, they've got 8 weeks to carry out a review. So if they put you in some awful place, are you really going to have to stay there for 8 weeks and then wait for a homelessness appeal? And the answer is no. You could ask them to deal with it urgently, and if they don't, you could think about going for a judicial review anyway, on the basis that the procedure that's available isn't sufficient to meet the need, and so judicial review is the only way forward. You've got to be careful doing that, though. It's really got to be urgent. And then the last bit about how do I instruct a solicitor? Being one, I guess the person making the referral wouldn't normally do the instructing, but if the person was vulnerable, they could provide instructions on behalf of that person as long as they were authorised. And the question of how do you challenge the council, I think I've done that. I tend to find putting in a complaint to the council on a sort of what you might call a immediate issue rather than a policy and a wider issue is not going to achieve anything, because at best you'll get an email saying we uphold your complaint, thanks and goodbye. So really what you've got to do is request a review or threaten judicial review as soon as you can. And that has the advantage of getting it into the hands of somebody more senior. And also they know that it's going further if they don't do something. So that is what I would say. The last point I'd make is there is a case I've seen recently, and I'll put a link to it on this later because I couldn't find it just now. And I'm sure there was a case where a local authority in London had put somebody in a hostel in exactly this type of situation. And when he'd raised these objections, they said exactly the sort of thing you were saying, Mike. And the judge said, no, you can't just do that. You have to actually carry out a proper assessment. So I'll come back on that.
There's some other stuff as well where I just
Yeah.
thought of. I mean, there's just some interesting stuff which one thing I've never actually found out for sure. So there's a statutory instrument in the Equality Act, and I want to say it's 21.28. Essentially, it basically makes the point that although substance dependency has a substantial impact on your long-term day-to-day living activities, it specifically can't be classed as a disability, except where the dependency, and I think he uses the word addiction, when the addiction started as a result of medical prescribing. Now, it's interesting and as I say, I've never had this kind of go all the way, but it's interesting to ask people who are using substances, particularly with benzos and with opiates, how were you introduced to this substance or this group of substances? And for many people, it is their GP prescribing them, particularly benzos particularly if they're older, because it used to be pretty common. But in theory, and to say I haven't tested this to destruction, but in theory, you might be able to make the case that actually, that person's initial dependency started as a result of medical prescribing, therefore it could be classed as a disability. I'd be interested to know if there are any lawyers who want to put a comment about that somewhere, because I'd like to know the real answer to it. But I certainly use that as just illustrating the fact that actually this is something which is real. And another thing with this as well is that this kind of, again, going on to the long piece of work to do with local authorities, particularly where they're unitary, you have the kind of social care, adult social care, often at odds with housing. They often get very frustrated with each other because the social workers have got duties to people with care and support needs. Substance users are care and support needs, and they've got particular duties, they've got particular concerns. And so in one sense, you can use the fact that the social worker may well agree with you to put pressure on housing and essentially have a reasonable conversation. That I've seen in councils that I've had contact with, that there is an increased, there's less silo thinking. There's safeguarding adult reviews which identify drug and alcohol issues. You can almost imagine the kind of safeguarding adult reviews which involve putting a vulnerable person with addiction issues in this kind of accommodation. I had a significant case I was working with a few years ago which was outrageous, and they did just that. They put her in a block. They knew full well it was already being cuckooed. She raised concerns and they did nothing for a year. So you can use that, but it's the long game. It's, I guess, for a solicitor like you're working with lots of different councils, whereas someone like me, it's mostly just going to be Bedford Borough Council, so you can keep that pressure on over years and see some positive changes with it.
Yeah, I do a lot of different councils, which is interesting, but things are changing. And I do think, going back to that point about what the origin of the drug addiction is, just to repeat myself, is that it's always important to think about whether the person had underlying issues of mental health problems, for instance, and that can include just depression and anxiety. It doesn't have to be psychosis. If you can show that, and you can show that they suffer from a disability, then you can argue that they're being discriminated against by being placed in somewhere without consideration of their condition.
I'll say one other thing, actually, Will. Sorry, I hope this is interesting. But so I've said to you before, like, challenging local authorities outside the M25 and outside the big cities is like shooting fish in a barrel. And I've come across, I've not dealt with before, supported a family to approach them following domestic abuse. 2 of the household members had disabilities, which we raised from day one. And I've finally got the subject access request documents back after months of chasing them and arguing with them. And there is literally no mention within their notes anywhere of the disability or the effects of the disability. So the point where they were told this information here, and then in their assessment they tick the no box. They tick there's nothing relevant box. And again, that's where you can start just raising these issues robustly with the council, saying you're just failing to give proper consideration to people's disabilities and people's needs. So yeah.
Even in London, you get a pretty low standard quite often, because there's years of sort of culture of just ignoring these things. And it's not uncommon to get, even now, saying your client can't be disabled because when they filled in the homeless form, they didn't tick the box that said they were disabled. and you think, there's slightly more to assess. But shall we have a look at the other one? Was a bit complicated, wasn't it? But let's have a quick look at that. Do you want to read that one out, Mike?
Yeah, sure. So again, this is from the Facebook group. Yeah, I have a client who has surprisingly been given a housing association property after fleeing domestic abuse, even though she has her name on the joint mortgage for the property she fled. She has been given a 6-month leeway to remove her name off the mortgage by housing. I'm assuming this is the housing department of the council. If she doesn't, she'll be charged. In fact, it might be the housing association. Or, yeah, it might be. If she doesn't, she'll be charged full rent backdated. The perpetrator has declined to remove her name, even though she has stated she wants no money, just her name removed. She cannot get legal aid for this and cannot afford a solicitor. Is there anything I can do to help my client force the perpetrator to remove her name off the mortgage? I'm also mindful that for tax reasons, etc., this is not straightforward. We now only have 11 weeks to get her name removed. The mortgage company has said no, they weren't able to help. So over to you for this one, Will, because I can tell you what I know, and that is going to be this is a very difficult situation indeed. I think the mechanics of how you do this is going to be very difficult. I think that with that time scale, you're really going to be up against it. So I think my question would be: was a 6-month period ever reasonable to actually achieve what they're asking of her? That's what I'll say. I don't know if you've got anything that can help a bit more than that.
Yeah, I agree with you. The first thing I say is it is a complicated question, particularly because, as with many problems, to quote Luke Clements, what you think is a simple problem is actually a cluster of problems. And here we've got a number of different problems overlapping. And I think we've both agreed that as housing specialists, neither of us really know the answer, although it is housing related, this problem of getting somebody's name off the mortgage. And if anybody knows the answer to that, how do you get your name off a mortgage where you split up with somebody and they're not agreeing to you taking the name off the mortgage? Please, can you comment? I'd really like to know. I've assumed that it might be part and parcel with transferring the title to the property, and you'd have to get a court order requiring that, because presumably if you're off the mortgage, you want to be off the title as well. And that's not registered as being a joint owner of the property, because you're going to have a problem with housing benefits if they do a search and find that you're the registered owner of a property. You wouldn't be eligible, I don't think. I've had cases where that's happened. But just focusing on the purely sort of housing law side of it that I'm used to, what seems odd in this case is that they gave her a housing association property. You'd think that this problem would have been the reason for not giving. They'd have said, oh, we'd like to give you one, but because of this tenancy, we can't. And they've actually made things a little bit easier for her because they've given her the tenancy. So their threat, if they want to carry out their threat, which is presumably to try and evict her if she doesn't get her name off the tenancy in 6 months, they'd have to take her to court and get a possession order. And in order to do that, they'd have to make out a statutory ground for possession, which would be something like rent arrears, antisocial behaviour. Not getting your name off a mortgage, it might come under some other term has been breached, but a judge is going to say, well, are you seriously saying you'll try and kick out a victim of abuse because they can't get their name off an old mortgage? And the other thing is that the pre-action protocol for possession proceedings for social landlords would require them to have engaged with her to try and help her with this, because what they could do is say to her, we don't know the answer to this, and it's clear you don't, and Mike and Will don't either, but what we can do is find you a specialist family solicitor who does deal with this, and we can help you instruct them, and we can pay for it. They could do that rather than evict her. Equally, if it got to the stage where the housing association were taking possession action against her, she could, in theory, go to her local authority and say, please, can you help me? I'm facing homelessness because of this problem. And they would then be under a prevention duty if she was threatened imminently, but under a wider duty to help her avoid homelessness. And they could do the same thing. And I have had this. It may seem absurd, because somebody say, are you seriously suggesting the council or the landlord have got to find her a solicitor and pay for them to do this? And it sounds naive, unrealistic, but I've had it in cases where people have got no recourse to public funds, that there is an argument, and I think it's worked in some cases, that if the problem is that somebody hasn't got immigration assistance, then the council, in discharging its duties to the children of the family under the Children Act, can refer and pay for assistance. I think this would be a good one, because the council would know that they'd have to rehouse her if she was evicted, and I think a housing association would have difficulty justifying this. And it might even again be discrimination, because this is a victim of domestic abuse. Most victims of domestic abuse are women. She's being discriminated against as a result of something arising from that. So she might have a full defence to a possession. So I think she'd be okay, but that doesn't answer the immediate question, which I'm afraid hopefully somebody else can answer. That's my sort of spiel on that one.
Yeah, I think there's a few things that might be worth saying as well. Is that it's entirely possible that essentially, this is a continuation of the domestic abuse in terms of the perpetrator refusing to allow her to remove
Yeah,
her name from the mortgage. So that, I guess, that doesn't help us either. But that kind of is that's another consideration in terms of how you would support an individual in this situation. I'm also surprised. I'm working with someone at the moment who's been in temporary accommodation for many years because they only own half a house and they can't get their name of the mortgage, and that said, the council's duty is to provide suitable accommodation, and they're essentially doing that at a peppercorn rent in order to do that. So I think that in terms of some stuff which we do know, if you're in a situation where you've got somebody who owns their own home and they're subject to abuse, then actually that doesn't change the council's duty to find suitable accommodation for them. And that's a question we often get on our training: is if you've got a mortgage, does that exclude you from Part 7 assistance under the
yeah,
Housing Act? And it doesn't. It's so someone could own their house outright. They can still approach the local authority, and the local authority still has a duty to provide suitable accommodation. And if they can't claim housing benefit because of their assets, that's the council's problem. That's not their problem. So that's
yeah.
something I can say that's helpful, but that's pretty much it in this case. I think it's really, I think I'm with you. I think really the Housing Association have made a rod for their own back. They'd have to show in detail how the steps they've suggested and supported her to take would have been enough to get this situation sorted. I think that's a tall order for them. I would hope that professionals can reassure her that she's not going to end up homeless again, that the Housing Association is going to have to essentially just bear with her whilst the solution's found.
Just one final thought on that is that it does highlight the fact that she was lucky to get a housing association. I don't mean lucky in the sense that she didn't deserve it, but she was fortunate that she got a housing association offer because they could have said no. And it highlights the difficulty people have if they do say no. They don't generally record that as a decision. They just say, "Oh, we've decided to offer you this private place," and you'd never quite know why that was. And this could have been the reason for it. And the Housing Association didn't record that. And it is a bit of a lottery when you get to the end of the homelessness process. And some people get offered a council tenancy, some people get offered a private place in Stoke-on-Trent, and other people get offered a housing association place. And you think it really is like just spin the wheel. And that's really unfair. It's a riddle, but it does seem. I have to advise people when they say, "Well, accept a duty to you, but I can't tell you what they're going to offer you," and they'd probably be within their rights to offer you private, even though they could offer you a council place. Where you've got families with children with disabilities or something, or physical disabilities, or adults with physical disabilities, they're more likely to get social housing because private landlords won't agree to adaptations and things. But other than that, it's pretty much a lottery.
I don't know if you want to just say what your opinion is on this, Will. Is that this is kind of, I do sympathise with local housing officers, but I guess I sympathise with people who are on the sharp end of this a bit more, or a lot more probably. But I think in one sense, that you have this defeatist attitude I see in councils, and I might be being really unfair in saying this because I don't envy their job at all. But in one sense, the lack of available housing, that is not an act of God. That's a political decision coming down from central government, but also within local government. And in one sense, any officer who is kind of, doesn't have the ability to discharge their duty in a fair way and in a lawful way, needs to be raising that in some way with their organisation. Otherwise, nothing will change. I think gatekeeping essentially does many things. One of the things it does is it hides the extent of the problem from central government in some respects, because people essentially never show up in the stats. So I think that's, in my opinion, unless we keep fighting for the law to be followed, nothing will change. In one sense, it is going to require millions of houses to be built. Then that's what we need to do. That's what the country needs
No,
to
I
do.
agree. It's a sort of psychological, political, sociological issue of how well-intentioned people who go to work in the housing departments probably learn not to make a noise about political injustice because partly because they see that it doesn't achieve much, and maybe it doesn't. If they have somebody has a chat with them about keeping to their job and not highlighting things. But that reminds me, we do have to keep challenging. And one of the problem with legal challenges is that it's only putting out individual fires. And although you may get some celebrated case in the Supreme Court which says you can't do this, that councils will just be studying that, looking at a way to get round it, and they probably will, and they'll make the next decision lawyer proof, which highlights something maybe we can talk about another time, is what you've been doing, which is something that we as lawyers don't have time to do or don't get funding to do, which is to pursue complaints up to the ombudsman level about things, even though the problem's put. The fact that the problem arose is another way of improving quality.
Yeah. Yeah, but yeah, I'll talk about that all day. I think it's something, a lot of effort is obviously expended locally by voluntary sector organisations on supposedly ending homelessness. But it's difficult to see a lot of these approaches really making any systemic change. So lay people can do it. That's, I think, partly what the Facebook group aims to do, is to actually equip people and not just tell people the answers, but say, actually, there's a bunch of other people in the country in different places all having the same problems, and there are some things that can be done about it. Yeah, that'd be, I think, yeah, as I say,
Hopefully
I
put
can
that on
talk
the
about that all day.
agenda for another meeting, because I'd like to find out more about how people can make complaints and what's the simplest, least amount of work and specialization you need just to get the ball rolling. Because hopefully once you get it to the ombudsman, once you go through the motions of probably complaining internally and getting it rejected, and then the ombudsman's supposed to pick it up and run with it and make inquiries, so you don't have to draft complicated legal pleadings as to what went wrong. Is that
I
right?
think that's how it should work. Yeah, I think there are certainly some kind of things I've learned in terms of kind of what sort of issues to go after. And actually, sometimes there are issues you can complain about which won't be upheld, because you're essentially complaining about the decision, and they'll just say it's a decision to be reviewed, not be complained about. But there's still value in making those complaints and doing them well. Yeah, there's a lot of things I've learned which I'm happy to talk about. But I think, yeah, not like a magic bullet, let's say that much. There's still plenty of ways that councils can wriggle out of stuff. But making a complaint, even when, say, you're making a complaint that the officer was rude, that's never going to get upheld. But it's still worth doing, because you think, okay, they're going to be a bit more careful next time with someone. Yeah, that would be an interesting topic to talk about.
Having said that, I should just say today I've made a stage 2 complaint on one of my cases where I felt strongly enough about it, because Haringey Council, believe it or not, have a policy which they were prepared to confirm in writing, where they book people into hotel accommodation. They don't renew it until the very day when it's due to end. So it's usually a Friday. So on the Monday, the person in the hotel gets told by the reception, "Oh, you're going on Friday. Did you know that? Can you make sure your room's clear?" And then they say, "Oh, hang on, the council are still inquiring into my circumstances. Could you check with them whether they're going to extend?" "Oh, no, that's not my job. You have to talk to the council about that." And then they talk to the council. They tried to talk to the council, but nobody. In fact, in the case of the person I'm complaining about, the housing officer said, "You got to talk. It's not my problem. Talk to temporary accommodation." They obviously didn't get through. But then when I made a complaint about this to start with, the response was, "Yes, we do this, but we think it's best to do this because you can't extend it too soon." So I thought it's ridiculous, because how could you say the day? And so also they said, "We do have a system for reviewing this in place." But the very next week, the poor guy got told that they were going to renew it, but the hotel said they've left it so late now, there isn't anywhere, so you can't stay. So he had to be moved way out. But I thought, I've got to make a complaint about that, because somebody's got to look at it and say they could improve the policy and maybe extend it 2 days before it ends, or make sure the staff tell people. But that's the sort of and really infuriating thing, which you wouldn't believe happened if you didn't come across
Yeah,
it.
standing about 5 p.m., 5:30 p.m., getting a call where you're going that night because no one's told you yet. Standard.
And it's really
And
scary, because Friday is the beginning of the weekend, and you're not going to get anyone in the temporary accommodation team on Saturday morning. And so you're facing a weekend sleeping on night buses if it doesn't work out. So it's really stressful.
yeah,
So on that happy note,
yeah,
I should
yeah,
wind up. I think that's been a really interesting chat. Let's do another of these soon, and maybe in a couple of weeks or something.
yeah. Sounds
So
good.
that's it. We were aiming to finish at 7, and it's now 7:01. I'll say goodbye then. If that's anything else you want to say, Mike?
No, I think that's good. Yeah, no, I enjoyed that. Thank you. That's cool.
Okay, great. Speak to you soon. Bye.
Yeah, take care. Bye bye.